Hello, hi, how are you?
Hello. Nice to meet you, Amal.
Nice to meet you as well. Thank you so much for taking the time today to speak with me. I really
My pleasure.
appreciate, yeah, I appreciate your willingness to talk about your family's story. I feel like you could provide a lot of valuable insight into my understanding of Canada's history. So, I'm doing this reflective paper on residential schools, how they affected kids back then, their families, and what the ongoing impacts are to this day as well. So, at any point, if you feel like the questions are too personal or sensitive, feel free to skip through them, okay? And if you need a break, we can always arrange that too. So, if you're comfortable, we can get started.
Sure. Sounds good.
Yeah, okay, sounds good. So, could you please tell me a bit about your family's Indigenous background?
Sure. So I am Métis through my mother's side. We are largely Scottish Métis. Our most recent family name is MacDougall, so we come from the MacDougall line, who are Métis who came from the Orkney Islands of Scotland and settled in Winnipeg, and then moved west over time, largely working as ferrymen and women. But I also have some French ancestry. I'm related to the Hamlin line. What are some other ones? Peter Fiddler. And there's Irish ancestry on that side as well. And my father is mostly English, German, and Danish. My mother's mother was Métis. Oh, but she was Métis through her father, and that was her mother's third marriage. So she's the only child that came out of that marriage. So she has multiple step-siblings, but none of them are Métis. She's the only one that has Métis ancestry. So because of that, that line is kind of disconnected from other Métis family because he moved far away from his family to enter that marriage, and the kids that he only had one, and the rest of them were not Métis. So I'm Métis through them, but disconnected otherwise from the rest of my Métis family.
Gotcha. Good to know. So I'm sure you are aware about the residential school system. So how do you think the policies have affected your family?
Yeah. So Métis people have had an interesting relationship with residential schools throughout history. Many Métis had to go to residential school. An example would be Maria Campbell, who's an elder that I've met before and who my family are familiar with. She went to residential school for some time, but the law kind of changed throughout her life as the government took a strategy of trying to force Métis people out of the Indigenous category and to force us into the white category. So we got moved around. Some Métis people went to residential school, some of us went to day school, and some of us never went. In that way also never received a formal education at all. So in my family, most of my older family members have very little education at all. In fact, my mother was the first family member of that line to graduate high school. So, we don't know for certain whether my great-grandfather went to residential school. We think it could be likely that he attended a day school, which were like a partial residential school, but you would go home at the end of the day. You didn't sleep there. So it's possible that he attended day school or that he perhaps worked at the day school. Sometimes Métis kids were so poor they would work jobs like cleaning or gardening at the day schools or residential schools, but not actually receive an education. At least that's how it was explained to me. So, yeah, a lot of that history has not been passed down. A lot of the stories weren't passed down on purpose. My great-grandfather didn't want to pass down the trauma and history that he experienced. So he kind of bottled it up, and he didn't share those stories because he didn't want us to carry that trauma.
Right. Is this related to a conversation that we were having the other day about your grandparents hiding, their indigenous identity, which kind of saved your mother from going to residential schools?
Yeah, my grandparents chose to hide their indigenous background. As we've gotten older, or as I've gotten older, and as my mother has gotten older, little pieces of our family history have become more clear. But there was a significant purposeful effort on the side of my grandparents to hide their indigeneity from us. And we think it might have been more my grandfather's idea to hide these things than my grandmother's idea. And my grandfather was white. He was an Irishman. So he may have harbored some personal racist feelings towards Native people and might have imposed that upon his wife. But at the same time, she also carried intergenerational trauma because of, the mistreatment of Indigenous people, and she probably didn't want to allow that intergenerational trauma to continue, which was perhaps another reason why she chose to keep it a secret.
Thank you for sharing that. How do you think learning about this part of your family's history made you feel at the time?
Well, learning about the trauma and shame definitely made me look differently at my grandparents. I always kind of viewed them as very happy-go-lucky people. And it definitely brought a new light to their life experience. And it's made me look at the way that they used to act differently as well. And how their lives have gone very differently. For instance, my grandmother, she got pregnant when she was 15 years old. And that was part of the reason why she never finished high school, because she had to stop and take care of her kids. But understanding the intergenerational trauma, for instance, in her case, she experienced sexual abuse within the family. It made me rethink why she got pregnant when she was 15, Perhaps she was hypersexual, which is sometimes a trauma response that people who have been exposed to sex as children experience, right? They seek out sexually risky behavior early in life because they experience it at a very young age. It kind of made me rethink that.
Mm-hmm. And this abuse, was it caused by someone from the indigenous community or someone from your grandpa's side? Are you aware about it or no?
I do know who it was. It was my great-grandfather, her father.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Are you aware if maybe he went to residential schools Could it have been some of the trauma that he, went through after attending that school system that he passed on to the next generation?
It's possible. So, like I was saying before, it's possible he could have attended day schools, or he could have worked at the day school and had a job as a child. They seemingly hired out child laborers to work at the schools who weren't able to attend. Or he could have experienced abuse just at church, which is pretty common too. It was normal in the time when people attended church for young boys and girls to experience sexual abuse. And I do know for a fact that my great-grandfather really disliked the Catholics. And he disliked French people. So we can assume as a child he probably attended a Catholic church. And this might also have been somewhere where he experienced abuse.
Right. And I remember you once mentioned that your family shared certain parts of your history with you, but not with your brother. Why do you think they made that choice?
Yeah, so like I was saying, that story of my grandmother's abuse at the hand of her father, those stories were shared with me, but they were not shared with my brother. I think there's maybe two reasons for this. The first, very simply, is that I did end up asking about it. I was curious about our family history and wanting to know more. Like I was wondering if, my great-grandfather or anyone in our family history attended residential school. And that's kind of when I found out about that. So, I was asking about our family history. But part of it, I also imagine, has to do with gendered expectations of emotional labor. I think women are expected to carry emotional loads of holding trauma in a way that boys are not expected to. For instance, while my brother is Métis and he has Métis citizenship, he's not really ever had to participate within the culture very much. He lives on the other side of the world right now. He lives in China. His life is fully disconnected from the land. He doesn't have much communication with the elders or much understanding of our family history. And I think he doesn't have much of an expectation to do any of those things. Because men are seen as kind of the secondary parents or culture givers, because women carry babies and they end up being the primary caregiver for those babies. There's a huge expectation of labor on the side of women in our community to learn the stories, to learn the language, to learn the traditional customs so that we can pass that on to our children. And I don't think that the young men are given the same weight of responsibility because they're not seen as the life givers. They're not seen as people who have to carry on the culture.
Do you think the settler colonial society had an influence on these thoughts? Because from what I've learned so far from all the readings from my textbook, it mentioned how women played, a big role in indigenous communities. They even had the power to, select the chiefs and stuff. So do you think colonists maybe played a role in changing this aspect of, seeing women as the bearers of emotional workload, stuff like that?
It is hard to say how much of this was imposed by settler colonialism. As Métis people, one of the downsides with our cultural hybridity is that in the early days of our nation's development, it was largely settler men who intermarried with First Nations women. And these two people came from very different societies with different expectation of gender roles. So the men met these women thinking that, they are the leaders of the household, and they should be the ones to make decisions. They should be the ones to, have control over women. And these women were coming from societies where they were the decision makers, they were the community organizers, and they really had at least equal, if not greater, power within their societies. So this created a bit of a tension, I think, in the early days of the Métis Nation. But ultimately, Métis society ended up adopting Catholicism, and in some cases Protestantism, but largely Catholicism as their religious practice. And Catholicism does carry patriarchy deeply embedded within their cultural practice. So these women ended up adopting a religion that convinced them to take more of a supportive role rather than a leadership role in their communities. And this is maybe where they were forced to take on more emotional baggage than the men had to carry. But then again, part of it maybe had already been part of First Nation society. I'm not exactly super knowledgeable about pre-contact First Peoples behavior, but I wouldn't be surprised.
Got it. Yeah, that's some very valuable insight, I feel. Are you aware about any particular stories from people who did go to residential schools, or do you or your mom know anyone who attended the school? Any experiences that they shared that stayed with you?
Yeah, I do have some family members through marriage who have experiences with residential school. For instance, Grandma Carol, who is Squamish First Nations. She married into my father's side of the family, so that side of the family are Squamish First Nations. They did go to residential school, and unfortunately, I think their experiences there led to significant shame. They ended up losing their status because they married a white man. Grandma Carol did. So back then you lost your Indian status if you married a non-native person. And after that law was overturned and they had the opportunity to get their Indian status back, Grandma Carol did not want to do that because she carried too much shame about the idea of being a native person, and that shame was certainly imposed upon her through residential school.
Right. Did she ever share with you how the school system was, any particular traumatic experiences she went through or saw fellow students go through? Did she ever share with you how the school system was, any particular traumatic experiences she went through or saw fellow students go through?
No, she wasn't very descriptive about her experiences. I think, once again, to try to protect us. I do know of some residential school survivors in the local area that I've chatted with who have shared some of their experiences. For instance, I met a woman who also was Coast Salish. She went to residential school, and while she was there, the teachers or organizers decided that she was sick, but she never felt sick. She never had any kind of reason to believe that she was sick when she was a kid. But they took her out of school and sent her to the building next door, which was a sanitarium. And she was experimented on at the sanitarium. They put all kinds of creams on her and would put her under bright lights. So, her family kind of believed they were probably testing sunscreen out on her. But yeah, there's a lot of medical abuse, as far as I'm aware, that went on in those schools. They were used as an opportunity to do whatever kind of human research the government wanted to do, because since the children didn't have any connection with their parents, they were extremely vulnerable persons. And that meant that they could basically do whatever they wanted to those kids, and they did.
Yeah, that's very unfortunate what all these kids went through. It's not something I can even begin to think about. It's just sad, to be honest. Yeah. What is one thing that you wish more Canadians or non-Indigenous peoples understood about the Indigenous families' experiences, especially when it comes to the lasting impacts of residential schools?
Yeah, I think a lot of settler people view residential schools like some kind of historical stain on Canada. Like it's something very, very that happened very long ago. I mean, the last residential school to closed in the 90s, right? 97. Yeah. That was after my brother was born, and he just turned 30, so that's not very long ago at all. And secondly, I think just because residential schools closed, that doesn't mean that the trauma that was inflicted upon the victims of residential school is over. I think the trauma that they experienced in their childhood is kind of permanent, right? When you're a child, your brain is still developing, so any kind of trauma that you experience creates pretty permanent neural pathways and mental issues in the long term. And if you never experience love in your childhood, and then you become a parent, you never learned how to love or care for your children. So inevitably, these people end up repeating the trauma that they experienced to each other, They repeat the cycle of trauma because they don't know of any other skills to discipline kids than to hit them or to show that they love their kids, because they never learned healthy ways to be around children.
Right, yeah. I feel like a lot of people, when they talk about colonialism, they feel like it's a thing of the past. But in addition to what you just said, there's just so many other issues that are still ongoing today, whether it is the issue of the missing and murdered Indigenous women, or the injustices in terms of the education provided to Indigenous peoples, or even in the healthcare system, right? There's just so many things going on, which makes it hard to believe that it's ended, right? It's still going on. Yeah.
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 Domestic violence remains a really big problem. In basically every reservation I've ever been to or heard about, domestic violence remains a significant issue. As does alcoholism. Alcoholism and drug abuse remains a huge issue in our communities because we don't have access to the necessary mental health care that we need to recover from these traumas. So people learn to self-medicate with alcohol. And that was an issue within my family too. My grandfather, the one who was white, but he was an alcoholic. And he got into alcohol because of my Métis great-grandfather. My mother's father grew up without a father. So since he married my grandmother as a teenager, my great-grandfather became his primary father figure in his life. And he learned a lot of really great skills from him, but he also learned a lot of negative coping skills. So, that trauma continues.
Right. What do you think your parents did differently than your grandparents when they were raising their kids?
Yeah, my parents did a fantastic job considering the traumas that they experienced when they were young. I think they did two things really well. Firstly, they had kids on purpose. They actually had the benefit of family planning available to them. So, my parents were already married and they had been saving up money and they had been preparing before they had kids. That alone makes a huge difference. You can imagine, becoming a parent suddenly as a 15-year-old doesn't set you up for success. Especially when there's so much societal shame around teen pregnancy, so your parents don't want to help you. You have all of this, responsibility and no skills, no support. You were bound to mess up in many different ways. And secondly, they had a lot of education. My mother actually became a social worker before she had kids. So not only did she graduate high school and university for the first time in our family's history, she actually studied parenting because she ended up working in child protection. So she already had healthy skills for navigating discipline, navigating tricky parental issues, which ended up being extremely important because my brother ended up being a bit of a problem child. If they had taken the easy way out, they probably would have disciplined him with spanking or with, verbal abuse or something. And that would have been a simpler way of getting him to act normally. But because they had actually taken the time to discipline him in a healthy way, my brother was able to thrive, right? Now he lives in China and he's a debate champion because he knows how to work through problems with his words instead of with violence.
That's good. I think that's very good parenting on their end. This makes me think, when you have kids or if you want to have kids, how do you think you're going to raise them? Would you like to tell them about the history of the family? Would you also, only tell the girl child about the history and not let the male child be affected by it? Or do you think you're going to pass the information equally to both of them if you do have two kids? Yeah.
I would certainly, if I had a boy and a girl, I would be sure to give them both the same information. In fact, I'd probably sit them down together to tell them the information so that we could all feel that as a family. I think that's the best way to heal, is for everybody to be together.
Let's take a break.
No, it's all right to be emotional. I don't have any problem.
What is something you wish you could tell your ancestors or family members who did certain things the way they did? I'm just gonna keep it very vague, so you can just feel free to talk about whatever you feel is comfortable. Yeah,
I would tell my family members that indigeneity, although they probably wouldn't understand that word, they would view it as being Indian or being native, because the term indigenous is pretty recent. My grandparents wouldn't have understood that, but being Indian, being a half-breed, being mixed, these are not things that are worth feeling shame about. There's nothing shameful about that. That your culture is a gift. And keeping your stories to yourself is not going to make your trauma go away, and it's not going to stop that trauma from continuing to future generations. Honesty is most important because we can't solve problems we don't know about. So that's what I would say.
I liked how you mentioned we can't solve problems we don't know about. So, yeah, I think that was very nice. I know you're an Indigenous artist, and I've seen how passionate you are about educating others about the Canadian history and the mistreatment experienced by Indigenous peoples. What does reclaiming and embracing your Indigenous identity mean to you today?
Learning and reconnecting with my Indigenous identity has been really helpful, both in my career, because I've gotten lots of job opportunities, and my willingness and eagerness to learn traditional Métis dances and songs and stories and language. But it's also been really helpful in terms of building community. So I've gotten to work with elders and knowledge keepers, and they have a lot of wisdom. So like Elder Aline Laflamme, for instance, I attend a drumming group with her, and she's trained in traditional mental health care, and she's helped me learn a lot about how to cope with my emotions. So it's been helpful also for my personal growth in terms of my mental health. Because while I'm a big fan of, medication and therapy and things like that, I think that traditional mental health care through Indigenous practice has also made a really, really huge impact on me.
Thank you for sharing that. Just one last question. How do you think non Indigenous peoples can meaningfully support and stand in solidarity with the Indigenous communities? Is there any hope for reconciliation? And if so, what does it look like?
I think reconciliation requires so much more than I think lawmakers realize or are willing to acknowledge. I think a lot of people think that simply saying out loud that residential schools happened and admitting it is enough. But in reality, residential schools coincide with so many other, layered elements of oppression that are soaked into Canadian society so deeply and fundamentally that we would have to kind of rebuild Canadian society from the bottom up to be able to achieve true liberation of Native people. It would require retreating and building proper treaties with every nation that existed pre-contact. It would mean massive investments into language revitalization, because, mind you, our languages aren't dying out because we're choosing not to learn them. They're dying out because decades of residential school made our language illegal to teach to our children. So the loss of those languages are directly at fault of residential schools. It would mean a massive investment into the preservation of traditional knowledge and ceremony. And when I say investment, I'm talking about financial investment. And it's a financial investment that I think needs to be made not just by the Canadian government. I don't think it should be necessarily on the burden of the average Canadian taxpayer. I think that a significant amount of this needs to be paid for by the church, because the Catholic Church, the Anglican Church, and the United Church are significantly at fault for the conditions of residential school and the religious and spiritual abuse that took place there. So I think they should hold a significant financial burden as well. What else? I'm really interested in how they've dealt with reconciliation in South Africa. I'm not sure if you've looked into that before, but after apartheid ended, they started creating laws that are built to prioritize jobs and opportunities very explicitly for Black people in South Africa. It's a little bit different there because Black people do make up a significant majority. So it means that the white minority are disadvantaged in job opportunities. It would be different here because Indigenous people now unfortunately make up a minority because of, generations of genocide and weaponized biological warfare, things like that. But I think really basically doing the opposite of what Trump's been doing, bring back having specific spots available in university for Indigenous people exclusively, incentivize workplaces to prioritize hiring Indigenous people. Even within our nations, this is a problem. I noticed within Métis Nation, British Columbia, we've been hiring a lot of non-Métis and non-Indigenous people to work for our government, which seems insane to me. Like, our own government should be hiring our citizens. Why are we hiring so many people who aren't Indigenous when those jobs could be given to Métis people who experience higher unemployment than any other group in Canada? How is this what we're prioritizing?
Yeah, it's a good thing you brought it up, because that was something I was also going to mention. And I did also mention it in one of my own classes that I'm taking for this Indigenous course. I feel like one way to actually achieve this reconciliation is by giving the positions of authority to Indigenous peoples, right? Because why are non-Indigenous peoples still continuing to make decisions for Indigenous communities? Most of them don't even know the entire history of Canada. They're so ignorant about a lot of things. How are they supposed to, bring about this change and put an end to this colonialism that is still happening in society today? That's definitely something to think about.
I think ironically the solution to reconciliation from residential schools coincides awkwardly with the prioritize of education within our community. So, so many of us experienced educational trauma. So we've learned that, school is not a safe place. It's not somewhere that we should spend our time. But quite frankly, we need Indigenous lawyers. We need Indigenous teachers. We need Indigenous politicians. And we're not going to be able to represent ourselves on the world stage if we don't have the necessary skills and education to do that.
That's correct. And it's ironic because as someone who moved to Canada as an immigrant about 9 years ago now, this country always seemed like a very welcoming place to me and to a lot of other immigrants who are my friends. Everyone views Canada as this diverse country which promotes equality amongst the citizens and things like that. But once you look beyond that mask, you unveil something that's horrific, so dark. The legacy, not just of residential schools, but a lot of other things that have happened in the past. So personally, I feel like I'm never gonna look at Canada the same way again. I feel like a lot of people need to still be educated about how this country came into being.
Quite frankly, the same country that colonized my people colonized your people. It's the same, British imperialism that's destroyed half of the world. They used to say the sun never sets on the British Empire. Have you ever heard that?
Right, yeah, absolutely.
Because every corner of the world has somewhere that's colonized by England, even still. The king is still our king. So it's really this kind of insurmountable effort to re-indigenize this country, because the only way that we exist as a legitimate country, according to the rest of the world, is through British colonization. If, indigenous nations were to try to, fully liberate themselves, we would be the smallest, poorest nations in the world. And we probably wouldn't be recognized in the United Nations because the G7 nations would not recognize us because they have a vested interest in our continued colonization and suffering.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for taking out the time today to have this conversation with me. We've shared a lot of valuable points, and it was very insightful. So, yeah, thank you.
Thank you for having me.